When you think of coffee, what's the first brand that pops into your head? Is it Dunkin' Donuts? Is it Tim Hortons if you're in Canada? Or is it Starbucks? Starbucks has over 38,000 locations around the world. And here's how the other coffee chains stack up in comparison. You can see that no one is catching up to Starbucks in terms of global market share anytime soon. So how did they get so big? Well, the short answer is a man by the name of Howard Schultz. But you're here for the full story, so let's start from the very beginning. Starbucks was founded by three friends, Gordon Bowker, Jerry Baldwin, and Zev Siegel. They were all from Seattle, but they went to school together in San Francisco. The three of them fell in love with Peet's Coffee Company. So Alfred Peet, the founder of Peet's Coffee, was responsible for bringing specialty coffee to Northern California when he opened his coffee shop Peet's Coffee back in 1966. The very first Starbucks location opened in Pike Place, Seattle back in 1971. They actually started off selling Peet's Coffee in Starbucks packaging. And eventually, of course, they started roasting their own coffee beans. Keep in mind though, from this point all the way until 1986, Starbucks only sold coffee beans by the pound. They weren't selling a beverage yet. So when Howard Schultz first came across Starbucks, he was on a sales call for a company called Hammerplast. He was actually in California when he heard a small company out of Seattle was buying Hammerplast thermal coffee makers to sell in their store. So he paid a visit to Starbucks in Seattle, and when he walked in, he instantly fell in love with the entire experience. From the romance of the coffee to how they were educating the customer on specialty coffee. He ended up meeting with Jerry Baldwin so they could form a vendor-customer relationship, and one thing led to another, and in 1982 he was offered the job of head of marketing at Starbucks. Remember, there was still no beverage being sold, they were still just selling coffee beans. At this time, Starbucks was about to open its fourth location. So Howard left his job at Hammerplast and traveled across the country from New York to Seattle with his girlfriend and their golden retriever. Early on, Starbucks had a lot of demand for their coffee beans from tourists that were visiting from other parts of the United States. So they were able to start a mail order business because there was nothing like Starbucks anywhere else. So tourists who would come and buy a bag of coffee beans would fill out a form so they could have coffee beans delivered directly to their house. In 1983, Howard went to a trade show in Milan, Italy. It was his very first time in Italy, and he couldn't help but notice one coffee bar after another. They were selling coffee as a beverage in the stores, not just the coffee beans. He was witnessing the coffee business, but just not the one that Starbucks was in. And he hurried back to Seattle to tell Jerry and Gordon what he saw. Howard wanted to implement the coffee bar business in Starbucks, but Jerry and Gordon were not about it. They turned him down. They wanted no parts of selling coffee as a beverage. But Howard, and you're going to see a pattern here, he didn't give up on the vision. After 2 years of asking them, Jerry and Gordon finally let Howard open up a small test coffee bar. This was within the 6th Starbucks store, and out of 1,200 square feet, they gave him 100 square feet to run the coffee bar. Howard actually designed and opened the coffee bar himself and even worked behind the counter as a barista. So Starbucks would typically get 200 to 300 customers a day coming to buy their coffee beans. At the coffee bar, after introducing lattes, cappuccino, and espresso, there were 500 customers in the first week. In Howard's eyes, this was a complete success. Unfortunately, 1 month into the coffee bar business, Jerry Baldwin wasn't going for it. He didn't like it at all and told Howard, "I don't want to be in the restaurant business." To Jerry, this was the restaurant business, but to Howard, it wasn't. It was an experience. Customers were coming back for an experience unlike anything else. Jerry was actually able to buy Peet's Coffee Company between 1983 and 1985. He now had Peet's Coffee Company and Starbucks. However, after buying Peet's Coffee, Starbucks ran into financial trouble. At the same time, Howard grew frustrated and was ready to leave Starbucks. Although Howard wanted to leave Starbucks, he didn't have the money to go out on his own. So Howard somehow started up his own company called Il Giornale. Il Giornale was a coffee bar, but separate from Starbucks. So not wanting to lose Howard, Jerry tells Howard, "Starbucks does not want to open up coffee bars, but we will invest in Il Giornale." Jerry just wanted to keep selling the coffee beans forever, and Howard just had a way bigger vision than Jerry. So Starbucks and a few others invested in Il Giornale, but Howard was still short $1.6 to $1.7 million that he needed to raise in order to get his dream off the ground. So what did Howard do? He flew to Italy to see two of the biggest companies in the coffee business. He met with the espresso company, Faema, and the largest Italian coffee company, Lavazza. They both basically told him, "Look, no one's going to buy Italian espresso in Seattle or anywhere else in America." But Howard didn't give up. You see a pattern here, right? He went back to visit the three titans of industry in Seattle. They were Jack Benaroya, a real estate developer, Herman Sarkowski, he was the original owner of the Seattle Seahawks and the Portland Trail Blazers and also owned a lot of real estate as well, and Sam Strum. who is nicknamed the Godfather of Giving in Seattle. All of these gentlemen had a net worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So Howard pitched them the coffee bar idea, and they invested to get Il Giornale off the ground. With the investment that he received, he was able to open 3 Il Giornale locations. 2 of them were in Seattle and 1 of them was in Vancouver. All 3 of the locations were doing well, but Howard didn't have the money to expand beyond that. The stores were less than 1,000 square feet, and he worked as a barista with a few of his friends to keep the costs down. Howard didn't pay himself a salary for almost 2 years. Meanwhile, while all this was happening, Howard's partner, Sherry, was working a full-time job while pregnant with their first child. Just to put things in perspective, Howard had left his full-time job to move across the country to work at Starbucks, and he still wasn't making any real money yet. It didn't look great, but it got even worse. When Sherry was 7 months pregnant, her parents came to visit them in Seattle. Her father asked Howard to go for a walk with him. He says to him, "Whatever you're doing, I respect it, but it's not a job. It's a hobby. You need to get a job. My daughter's pregnant, she's working, you're not." Howard had no response to this. He just started to cry. He came home that afternoon completely shook, needing to tell Sherry what had happened. Sherry was already angry with her dad. She told Howard, "There is no way we're going back. We're going to keep going." In this instance, Sherry was the one that didn't give up and kept the Starbucks dream alive. So Howard's coffee bars were up and running, but Starbucks was still in financial trouble. So Jerry comes to Howard and tells him he and his wife were moving to California. They were going to keep Pete's Coffee and sell Starbucks. Jerry says to Howard, "I think you're the person to buy Starbucks." This is what Howard wanted. He could turn Starbucks into coffee bars with complete control of the business, with no one shutting his ideas down. Howard tells Jerry, "That's fantastic, but I don't have any money. How much is it?" And Jerry says, $3.8 million. It was now 1987, and Jerry gave Howard 90 days to raise the money to buy Starbucks. Around the second month, Jerry comes to Howard and asks him how much of the money he's raised. Howard was less than halfway there. Jerry tells him that one of his initial investors has put in an all-cash offer and wants to close right away, with no due diligence. As soon as Howard heard who it was, he knew it was over. He had lost his chance to buy Starbucks. That night, Howard was playing in his basketball league. After the game, he was visibly upset and told his good friend Scott Greenberg what had happened. Scott was an attorney at a prestige law firm in Seattle. Scott told Howard that he needed to come in the next morning to tell the same story to their senior partner at the firm. Howard met with the senior partner the following morning. It was Bill Gates Sr. Yes, that Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft. It was his dad. So Howard tells Bill the whole story, and Bill responds with, "Howard, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. The first is, everything you told me true?" Howard responded, "Yes." "And have you left anything out?" Howard responded, "No." So Bill Sr. tells Howard to come back in 1 hour. When they come back in an hour, he tells Scott that he wants to talk to Howard alone. Before Howard could sit down alone with Bill, Bill tells Howard that they're going to go for a walk. So they go to Rainier Tower in Seattle and visit Sam Strum's office. Yes, this was the mystery investor that tried to steal Starbucks away from Howard. So they walk into Sam's office and Bill leans over the desk and tells Sam, "I don't know what you're planning, but whatever it is, it's not going to happen. Howard Schultz is going to buy Starbucks Coffee Company and he's never going to hear from you again." And then they walked out, and that was it. Howard still didn't have the money. He didn't understand what had just happened. Bill Sr. told Howard, "You're going to buy Starbucks Coffee Company, and my son and I are going to help you." That was how Howard Schultz purchased Starbucks Coffee Company in 1987 for $3.8 million. Bill Gates Sr. actually never mentioned publicly or took credit for helping Howard buy Starbucks. When the acquisition was official, Howard had 3 Il Giornale locations already. Now he had bought 6 Starbucks stores and 2 were under construction. By the end of the calendar year in 1987, Starbucks had 11 stores and 100 employees. Howard and Company now had the stores, the brand name, and the roasting facility. At the 1988 shareholder and employee meeting, Howard highlighted how Starbucks operates and delivered his vision for the future of Starbucks. He said, "We focus on our people, the employees. They delight the customer, and the customer satisfies the shareholder. You have no idea what we have here. This will change America. This will be America's coffee house." He went on to say, "This company since 1971 has been growing at a very, very slow pace. As a result of that, when you combine Il Giornale and Starbucks together, we're going to take your 6 stores that you built in 17 years and go to 26 stores in 1 year and over 100 stores in 5 years. At the time, this sounded crazy to everybody. Once Starbucks was ready to expand out of Seattle, they went to Chicago, but they were very patient. Chicago didn't take off right away. There were issues that they needed to work through. Howard now had 2 new partners, Howard Behar and Orrin Smith. Bihar was the one that went to Chicago and made sure operations were running smoothly before they were ready to expand further. Oren, Howard says, was the adult in the room and the only one with an MBA education. After Chicago, they expanded to Los Angeles, and to their surprise, the celebrities embraced Starbucks. Starbucks made history putting their employees first in both 1988 and 1991. But first off, why did they do this? Howard grew up in a family with no health insurance, and he saw what that did to a family. In 1988, Starbucks rolled out health benefits to include part-time employees and gay couples in domestic partnerships. This benefit plan was the first of its kind. At the time, Starbucks only had 33 stores. It was important to Howard to build a company that went above and beyond to provide its employees with respect and dignity. This all came from his upbringing in a dysfunctional household. He wanted to crack the code on how to create employee benefits that exceeded the expectations of their employees. The team had discussions early on about how do we exceed the expectations of our people so they can exceed the expectations of the customer. In 1991, Howard wanted to give equity in the form of stock options to every single employee in the company. They ended up giving 14% of everyone's base pay in the form of stock options, and Howard made sure to do it the year before the IPO, so the employees wouldn't miss out. The program was called Beanstalk, and it provided equity in the form of stock options to anyone working 20 plus hours a week. This was the turning point in the culture of Starbucks. The day they announced this, employees were no longer employees anymore. They were considered partners. At this time, Starbucks was now up to 55 stores and had officially expanded to Los Angeles. Before we go on with the story, here's a quick background on Howard Schultz. Howard grew up poor, living in the projects in Brooklyn, New York. His family was, as he described, dysfunctional, more or less due to the pressure of money. Howard's mind was always imprinted with the memory of how his father growing up felt disrespected, devalued, and vilified as an uneducated blue-collar veteran. Howard's father worked a series of jobs and never truly, quote-unquote, made it financially. An important thing to add is that Howard learned a lot about dealing with rejection and humility in his sales job with Xerox in the 70s. Now back to the Starbucks story. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Costco. Early on, Costco helped Starbucks quite a bit, and vice versa. If you don't already know, Costco was founded by Jeff Brotman and Jim Senegal. Jeff was one of the early investors that helped Howard buy Starbucks. He became one of Howard's biggest mentors. Jeff introduced Howard to Jim, and one thing led to another, and Starbucks began selling their coffee beans in Costco. Howard told Jeff and Jim straight up that he didn't know how Starbucks would do selling in Costco. They told him to meet at a Costco parking lot in Kirkland on a Sunday morning. When Howard got there, they said to him, "Look at the cars. Those are your customers." At this point, Starbucks wasn't on the East Coast of the United States yet, but Costco was all over the US. So being in Costco allowed Howard to see how many customers they already had on the East Coast. In the early to mid 90s, Starbucks was now in Seattle, Vancouver, Chicago, LA, Portland, and Washington, D.C. But Howard Bihar didn't feel they were quite ready for New York, so they chose to enter Boston next. They chose Boston because they already had coffee bars. Coffee bars weren't a foreign concept there. They had a high-quality competitor that was already doing it called Coffee Connection. Coffee Connection was like Pete's Coffee, except on the East Coast. Boston, of course, also had Dunkin' Donuts. So rather than compete with Coffee Connection, Starbucks acquired them. They already had the best real estate with the best foot traffic and had spent the money to figure this out. So it was a no-brainer to buy them rather than to compete with them. So Starbucks officially purchased Coffee Connection in 1994. They paid $23 million for 23 locations that were making a total of $16 million a year in revenue. But the locations actually weren't the most valuable part of the deal. The most valuable asset that was part of the deal was the trademark that Coffee Connection owned on the word Frappuccino. By 1995, Starbucks was up to 500 stores, but still not well known on the East Coast. They were now the only place you could get a Frappuccino, which was also the first blended cold drink that Starbucks ever introduced. But Howard just knew that the drink also needed to be bottled and sold. So Howard flew to Atlanta, the Coca-Cola headquarters, and New York, the Pepsi headquarters, in the same day. The Coca-Cola meeting lasted less than 30 minutes, and they dismissed him without even letting him properly explain what he was trying to do. He then went to New York and met with Roger Enrico and Craig Weatherup of Pepsi. Craig Weatherup, after writing the agreement down on a napkin, shook hands with Howard and formed a multi-billion-dollar business. It was a 50-50 joint venture partnership between PepsiCo and Starbucks for the bottled Frappuccino that we now see today. The year after the Frappuccino launched, it made up 7% of Starbucks' total revenue. After expanding to Boston, Howard took multiple trips to Europe and Asia to see the opportunity for international expansion. He took Europe off the board because they already had coffee bars, and expanding to Europe would be like an American luxury goods brand trying to compete with Louis Vuitton. Howard started to focus on Japan. Japan had a coffee shop called Doutor, which had a few thousand locations across Japan. It was quite successful. The board of directors at Starbucks was resistant to going to Japan. They hired a consultant to do a study to determine if they should expand to Japan or not. The consultant returned with a large book of reasons why Starbucks couldn't succeed in Japan. These reasons included the economics wouldn't work, no one in Japan would walk in the street with a cup of coffee, the no smoking policy was a non-starter, and they couldn't afford the rent in Japan. Howard was not happy about this, of course. However, one day they received a handwritten letter from a Japanese company. Its founder had a restaurant in Los Angeles and he was enamored with Starbucks. They weren't ready, but decided to give it a shot anyway. The team went to Tokyo to meet the Japanese founder and formed a joint venture partnership with him. So Starbucks has this thing where whenever they go to a non-English speaking country, they make sure to go in with a partner and they form a joint venture partnership with them. They don't believe in franchising, but this is the closest thing to franchising that they have. 50-50 partnership. The grand opening of their first Japan store happened on a humid August day in Tokyo. There were about 200 people in line. Howard couldn't believe it. These people didn't even speak English. After Howard cuts the ribbon to symbolize that the store is now open for business, a young man races inside. He appeared to be a college student who slept in line overnight to be the first person to enter. When he approached the counter, he said, "Double tall latte." Howard, once again, couldn't believe it. Japan was an extraordinary success for Starbucks from the first minute. In a few months, Starbucks coffee cups were all over Tokyo. They now, today, have approximately 2,000 stores in Japan and a roasting facility. By 1997, Starbucks had crossed 1,000 stores globally. So now they succeeded in Japan, and their sights were now set on China. Starbucks entered the market with a partner in China, just like Japan. However, it didn't work out because the partner didn't share the same values as the company. They ended up buying out the partner and all the stores in China became company owned. Starbucks struggled in China for almost a decade. They lost a lot of money and there was tremendous pressure inside the company to close the stores down in China. It was rough, but Howard eventually discovered someone by the name of Belinda Wong. Belinda was an extraordinary operator and had a great touch with people, and Howard credits Belinda 100% for turning things around in China for Starbucks. Up until now, we went over the rise of Starbucks. Now we're gonna get into the fall of Starbucks. Yeah, Starbucks had a rough patch even after expanding into Japan and China successfully. In the year 2000, Howard took a step back and assumed the role of executive chairman. He handed the role of CEO to Oren. He had a lot of confidence in Oren, so he wasn't worried. Howard was still engaged in the business, just not the day-to-day operation. At this time, Starbucks had 3,500 stores worldwide and was doing $2.2 billion in revenue. Oren eventually transitioned the role of CEO to Jim Donald. It didn't work out with Jim, and Starbucks was now in some trouble. The 2007-2008 financial crisis was upon them, and Starbucks was 7 months away from being insolvent. The market cap of Starbucks dropped from $30 billion to $7 billion. Growth began to slow. It was evident that Howard needed to come back as the CEO. Howard returned to the helm of Starbucks in January of 2008. He had to make the difficult decision of closing 1,000 Starbucks stores. He held a company-wide meeting. He apologized to everyone because they had to close stores and lay people off. There were stores that shouldn't have been open and weren't performing while Howard wasn't in charge. Howard was afraid Starbucks would get acquired by someone else, and he made a last-ditch effort to save the company. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, the Starbucks family went to New Orleans and committed to community service in the 9th Ward. The next day, they walked through and built a tutorial on how to restore the business and held classes. On the third day, Howard made his infamous speech at the Basketball Coliseum in front of 10,000 people. He told them the truth, that in 7 months, they would be insolvent. But he had a formula of how many additional customers each store would need to bring in to turn things around. It was 10 to 11 additional customers per store per day. Things turned around in less than a year. In 2008, Starbucks had profits of $315 million. By 2010, they were up to over $900 million in profit. Starbucks has 6 roasting facilities throughout the world. They sit in Seattle, Chicago, New York, Tokyo, Shanghai, and Milan. These facilities were the biggest entrepreneurial creative project for Howard. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was his favorite movie as a kid. He invited the most creative people in the company to his house and turned the movie on. They went to work designing a space. They ended up creating a 30,000 square foot space in Seattle. It was dynamic and possessed the entertainment vehicle of theater while still encompassing the romance and seduction of their coffee. The facility opened to great reviews. They were manufacturing and roasting coffee in the space, which was open to to the outside world, similar to what Willy Wonka did with chocolate. Starbucks actually received approval from the Chinese government to build one just like it in the center of Shanghai. But of course, the shrine had to be in Milan, Italy, where it all started. So Starbucks' joint venture partner in Italy was the Percassi family, headed by the retired Italian footballer Antonio Percassi. The Percassi family is big in the real estate business. So Howard was traveling back and forth to Milan as he was being shown various properties by the Percassi family. He kept telling them, "This is not the right site," time and time again. Then it hit him. He was standing on the corner of Corduzo Square and he looked up at a space and said, "What about that?" And they told him, "That's the post office. You can't get it." And Howard was like, "Well, it's empty." And they said, "You still can't get it." And Howard says, "Can I meet the landlord?" And they say, "Howard, it's the government." And Howard says, "Well, who's responsible for it?" Long story short, the Percassi family arranged a meeting of Howard and the broker involved with the post office. Howard ends up finding out that the real story is that the government buildings were sold to private equity firms during the financial crisis. It turned out that the owner of the empty post office was Blackstone. Howard says to himself, "Why am I in Italy?" and phones up his good friend Jonathan Gray, who is the global head of real estate at Blackstone. John became a fan of Starbucks when he was in Seattle for an event. He saw the roastery in Seattle and knew exactly what they were trying to do with the space. So Howard phones up John and says, "Hey John, I'm in Milan, Italy. Do you realize you own this space in Corduzo Square that used to be a post office?" And John says, "Let me check." And then Howard says, "I'm coming to meet you." They ended up doing the deal with Blackstone to acquire the space for their prime roasting facility situated in Milan. Regardless of what you think of Starbucks, it was never intended to be a luxury brand. Howard Schultz and company were always focused on the customer experience and the quality of the coffee. They were the first privately owned US company to offer a stock option program that included part-time employees. They were also one of the first to offer full health benefits to part-time employees and coverage for domestic partnerships. In 2014, they introduced the Starbucks College Achievement Plan. Starbucks implemented this program to address the growing cost of higher education in the United States, as it's increased by over 500% since the mid-1980s. The program creates an opportunity for eligible US partners to earn bachelor's degrees through Arizona State with full tuition reimbursement. The plan expects at least 25,000 Starbucks partners, or formerly employees, to graduate through this program by 2025. All of the above mentioned initiatives were brought on by Howard Schultz, or the culture that he instilled in the company. The partners, formerly referred to as employees, always came first. Treating them well and providing them benefits that surpassed their expectations is what led to retention, which led to less training of new hires and a better overall experience for the customer. Howard Schultz currently has a net worth of approximately $2.8 billion US. He built an empire on the principles of treating employees in an exceptional manner. He provided healthcare and equity in the business to Starbucks partners, formerly employees, which was lacking in all the jobs that he saw his father work growing up. He didn't need to do this. He could have built a specialty coffee business just like the others. Starbucks stands alone at the top mainly due to what it has done and continues to do for its employees, in my opinion. If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, be sure to drop a like and subscribe.